Arambham Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Be seated, please. Ishvara. Good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Very good. Welcome to you all. Nice to have you here. And welcome to all of our students watching these classes online. We continue our study of the Bhagavad Gita today, going into the next chapter, chapter 17, Shraddha Traya Vibhaga Yoga. I'll explain the title after we do some chanting. As always, as I'm chanting, be sure to read the translation and then repeat after me. Arjuna uvacha, Arjuna uvacha, ye shastra vidhamutsrajya, ye shastra vidhamutsrajya, yajante shraddhayanvitaha, yajante shraddhayavitaha, tesham nishtatu ka Krishna, tesham nishtatu ka Krishna, Satvamaho rajastamaha, satvamaho rajastamaha. Shri Bhagavanu vacha, Shri Bhagavanu vacha. Trividha bhavati shraddha, Trividha bhavati shraddha. Dehinam sa swabhavaja, Dehinam sa swabhavaja. Satvaki rajasi chaiva, Satvaki rajasi chaiva, Tamasi cheti tam shrinu, Tamasi cheti tam shrinu, Sattvanurupa sarvasya, Sattvanurupa sarvasya. Shraddha bhavati bharata, Shraddha bhavati bharata, Shraddha mayoyam purusho, Shraddha mayoyam purusho, yo yat shraddha saheva saha, yo yat shraddha saheva saha. Yajante satvika devan, Yajante satvika devan, Yaksharakshansi rajasaha, Yaksharakshansi rajasaha. Pretan bhutaganan Pretan bhutaganan Yajante tamasajanaha, Yajante tamasajanaha. Ashastra vihitam ghoram, Ashastra vihitam ghoram. Tapyante ye tapo janaha, Tapyante ye tapo. Dambhahankara samyuktaha, Dambhahankara samyuktaha, Kamaraga balanvitaha, kamaragabalanvitaha karshayanta sharirastham sharirastham bhutagramamachetasaha mam chaivanta sharirastham tam vidyasura nishchayan Very good. So we begin chapter 17 as we come towards the end of the Bhagavad Gita. Chapter 17, Shraddha Traya Vibhaga. The word yoga here means chapter. Doesn't mean a spiritual practice. It's not that doing this vibhaga is a spiritual practice. This is a chapter about the vibhaga, the separation of Shraddha Traya. Traya, three kinds of Shraddha. Commonly, Shraddha means faith. So that happens to be the first topic. An analysis of three kinds of faith. What are the three kinds? Not surprisingly, Sattvika, Rajasa, and Tamasa. So according to the three gunas. But that's just the first topic. The chapter is titled after the first subject matter. The second subject matter is three kinds of ahara, food. First, three kinds of Shraddha, faith. Second, three kinds of ahara, food. Third, three types of yajna, worship. Then, three kinds of tapas. Then, three tapas austerities. And then, three kinds of dana, charity. So you get the pattern of the chapter. It closes with a little different subject matter, but this is our structure, analyzing human behavior using the lens of the three gunas. So this started back in chapter 14, right? Where we learned the three gunas. Sri Krishna did a wonderful analysis of how the three gunas are manifest in our thoughts and our behaviors. And then after chapter 14, skip chapter 15, then chapter 16, which we just concluded, was the consequence of these three gunas in creating asura, demonic tendencies, and daiva, divine tendencies. So that analysis of human behavior continued, started in chapter 14, continues in chapter 16, and now here we see it in chapter 17, human behavior through the lens of the three gunas, and it concludes in chapter 18. The reason I'm elaborating on this is, do you think Sri Krishna considers this an important topic? That's my point. So the fact that so much is dedicated to this topic shows a great importance of, and let's be very clear about how this fits into spiritual practice. I'll remind you of something we discussed way back in chapter 14, and that is all this analysis in terms of three gunas is not for the sake of judgment. It's not so that you can say, oh, he is so tamasic. Oh, she is so sattvika. Or even judgment with regard to yourself. To label yourself, oh, I'm so this, I'm so that, is harmful. Because it's harmful if you judge someone else, it's harmful if you judge yourself, because whoever you're judging is so much more than what you're judging them on. This chair is back a couple of inches. Feels funny. Okay. I just lost my train of... Okay. So whoever you can we define you with one word? Sattvika. You're a little more complicated than that, right? Anyone and everyone is this really complex intermixture of traits and tendencies. You'll use the word khichdi. So we're all some kind of khichdi. We're all some kind of combination, some kind of mixture, and that's human nature. And the reason I'm stressing this is as we continue through this chapter, this analysis is not meant for judgment of others or of yourself. This is meant for self-understanding, to understand when you do something, why. If you do something without understanding why you did it, there's a real lapse of inner understanding. And we need that understanding for the sake of emotional and spiritual growth. By the way, those two are interrelated. Spiritual growth comes along with, you can have emotional growth without much spiritual growth, but I'll guarantee you, spiritual growth will be stunted unless it's accompanied by emotional growth. So there's a lot of focus here in these chapters, both 14, 16, 17, and the first part of 18, a lot of focus on psychology. And maybe that is one of the many reasons the Bhagavad Gita is the most widely studied scripture, because it really focuses on human behavior in a very practical way. And you'll see in this chapter, I think more than any other chapter in the entire text, a lot of emphasis, which is very practical in nature, addressing your lifestyle. And I have a lot to say about lifestyle. I'll hold it off until we come to that section, maybe later in this class. So, with that introduction, we can begin this chapter. So we begin with an analysis of Shraddha, faith, through the lens of the three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas. And the question begins. The chapter is initiated by Arjuna's question. Notice that not all chapters are initiated by a question from Arjuna. This one is. Let's begin. Arjuna vacha ye shastra vidham utsrajya yajante shraddhayanvitaha tesham nishtatu ka Krishna Sattva rajastamaha. Arjuna asks, ye yajante, connect those two words, those who yajante worship. Those who worship, those who perform worship, those who are shraddhaya anvitaha, those who are anvitaha, endowed. Endowed with what? Shraddhaya. Endowed with Shraddha. I just want to point out there are several meanings of Shraddha. Sometimes we use Shraddha. Actually, we'll explain it now. So there are several meanings of Shraddha that we use. The most common meaning, faith, and that's fine. When we use Shraddha as a technical term in Advaita Vedanta, it does not mean faith. We have to be ready to deal with technical vocabulary. When Shraddha is used in a non-technical sense, as it is in this chapter, it means faith. Fine. But when we say you should have Shraddha in Guru and Shastra. Guru, teacher, Shastra, scripture. In that expression, you should have Shraddha in Guru and Shastra. It does not mean faith in the sense of blind faith. Whatever the Guru says, yes. Yes. Sorry, I don't mean to make fun of anyone, but that's so, and whatever the sorry, and whatever the scripture says, yes, you just swallow it whole. That is not Shraddha in Guru and Shastra. A better translation is trust, the same kind of trust that you have in your eyes and ears. You trust your eyes to see what's in front of you. You trust your ears to hear the sounds. You trust the Guru to give you proper guidance. You trust the Shastra to give you teachings which aren't available anywhere else. And trust is an important word because trust is something that is verified. Faith is not verified, right? If you have faith that our Father who art in heaven, if you have faith in that God, then can you verify that? Unverifiable. Shraddha in the sense of faith, blind faith, andha vishwasa, is unverifiable. When we use Shraddha as a technical term in Advaita Vedanta, better to translate it as trust, and it is verifiable trust. You can verify the validity of what your Guru tells you. You can verify the validity of the teachings. It's not a matter of blind faith. There's a more technical expression. I'll just share this before we plunge into this chapter. The technical usage of the word Shraddha in Advaita Vedanta, in technical terms, means to accept the authoritativeness of that source, to accept to recognize Guru and Shastra as authoritative. That's another way, it's a fancy way of saying trust, but it makes more sense in the context of teaching. When you were back in school and college, you looked upon your teachers as authorities in whatever they were teaching. In fact, if you failed to look upon them as authorities, you wouldn't have listened and you wouldn't have learned. So, for a teacher and a book back in your school days, you trusted them as being accurate sources of knowledge in the same way. We have trust in Guru and Shastra, but again, not blind faith, but rather it is verifiable. What is that definition? Trust pending verification, I think is an expression often used. Trust pending verification. Okay, enough said now that we know what Shraddha means, but here in this chapter, we're not using the technical Vedantic sense, we're using the more general sense. So Arjuna says, Ye yajante, those who worship, those who are Shraddhaya anvitaha, those who are endowed with Shraddha, faith. What about them? Shastra vidham utsrajya yajante. They worship, but Arjuna observes that sometimes they yajante, sometimes they worship utsrajya, setting aside Shastra vidhim, the rules of the scriptures. Arjuna has observed that some people worship without following scriptural rules. And in Arjuna's time, scriptural rules were pretty, how shall I say, daunting. They were so extensive and they were so rigidly applied to the performance of rituals, which is one of many reasons to do these rituals properly. You hire a priest because you can hope that the priest follows all these scriptural rules. You may not know the scriptural rules and may not be able to follow them. Naturally, then you'll hire a priest. But here, Arjuna has observed that there are many who do various kinds of rituals, not hiring a priest, doing them on themselves, by themselves, on their own, but without following all the scriptural rules. So Arjuna asks in the third line, Krishna, O Krishna, Tesham, for those people who have faith, meaning pure hearts. They're worshiping Ishvara after all, but without following scriptural rules. So Arjuna asks Krishna, Tesham, for those people, ka nishtha, what is their orientation, O Krishna? Is their orientation, what is their basis? Is their outlook? Is their outlook sattvam, based on sattva guna? Is their outlook rajas, based on rajoguna, or tamas, based on tamoguna? Is their perspective sattvika, rajasa, or tamasa? And here's the threefold lens, so to speak, that will be used throughout the chapter. So, based on this question, Sri Krishna replies, Shri Bhagavanu Vacha, Shri Bhagavanu Vacha, Trividha Bhavati Shraddha, Trividha Bhavati Shraddha, Dehinam Sa Swabhavaja, Dehinam Sa Swabhavaja, Sattvaki Rajasi Chaiva, Sattvaki Rajasi Chaiva, Tamasi Cheti Tan Shrinu, Tamasi Cheti Tan Shrinu. So, Sri Krishna replies that Shraddha Bhavati is Trividha, of three kinds, Dehinam, for all embodied people. And that Shraddha, that Shraddha is Swabhavaja. It is born from one's inner nature, from one's disposition, from one's personality, from one's mental disposition. And this really ties back to something we discussed quite a bit in chapters 14 and 16. Your personality, your temperament, is your personality and temperament, including your tendencies to be sattvika, rajasa, tamasa. Are you born, this is a trick question, see how you do. Are you born with these tendencies, or are they acquired? Are you born with these tendencies, or are they acquired tendencies? And if you answer this question properly, this trick question properly, the answer, of course, is yes, both. Right? Nature and nurture, both. So, none of us are born with blank slate, born as blank slates, as every mother knows. I don't know that, but every mother knows that every child seems to have something they're born with. In the Hindu tradition, we call it samskara, a trait or tendency of a prior life that has carried along with the sukshma sharira. When that subtle body got associated with in mother's womb, with the fetus, then those tendencies from a prior life become manifest. We call that samskara. But then, that's the nature part. In science, we call it genetics. By the way, if you ask, why did this gene get in? Remember, your genes come from both mother and father. So why did you get this gene from mother and not the gene from father? Is my analysis correct? Genes will come. The genes that form your chromosomes will come either from mother or father. So then the question becomes, why did I get this? Why am I stuck with this gene? And I didn't get that gene. Everyone has this kind of complaint. Well, if you ask a scientist, they'll say, it's random. That's the scientific explanation, that it is a random process through which these strands of DNA get assembled when when the sperm and ovum meet each other. But it's not a stretch of the imagination to say maybe some karma has some effect. Maybe it is karma that determines which genes are included in the chromosome and which are not. It's just an alternate explanation. But notice both science and the doctrine of karma are basically explaining the same thing. And that is, at birth, certain traits are determined. That is the nature part. But then comes the nurture part. And the nurture part is also pretty complicated. The first part of the nurture part is what you get from your parents. Second part of the nurture part is what you get from school, education. And the third part of the nurture part is what you choose. We have choice also. And just to make that very clear, your choices affect your disposition. I'm sorry to share this, but it just struck me. There was a study done, apparently, on how the consumption of pornography affects the brain, not just mind, but actually affects the brain. So the person's choice led to some dramatic changes in thinking and behavior. So this is a choice. Our choices in life are highly formative. So it's not merely nature. It's not merely your parents. It's not merely your school and upbringing. Also, it is your choices every day. And I don't think if we try to find out which of these are prominent, which of these are most prominent, I don't know that we could even determine that. All of them contribute. So each one of those factors, samskaras that you're born with, parents, the upbringing, childhood, etc., and your decisions in life. All four of these contribute to your swabhava, your inner nature. And the shraddha is swabhavaja, depends on your inner nature. Your inner nature, which might be sattviki, it might be rajasi. So sattvika, sattviki, same meaning. Rajasi, rajasa, same meaning. Tamasi, tamasa, same meaning. And cha iti tan, about them, shrinu. Arjuna, listen as I describe those three kinds of shraddha. Sattvanurupa sarvasya, sattvanurupa sarvasya, shraddha bhavati bharata, shraddha bhavati bharata, shraddha mayoyam purusho, shraddha mayoyam purusho, yo yat shraddha saheva saha, yo yat shraddha saheva saha. Sarvasya bharata, or Arjuna, sarvasya, for everyone, shraddha bhavati, shraddha is what? Sattva anurupa. Anurupa, in keeping with sattva, and here you need a little Sanskrit. And this is why we can't really get proper meaning of these scriptures without commentaries, without understanding the language properly, because this sattva is not that sattva. This sattva is not guna. There's a common expression in scriptures that refer to the antakarana, the mind in general. The mind in general is called sattva. Sattva is the name of a guna. So why then do scriptures refer to the mind as sattva? Because your body is made of tamasic stuff. Your prana is made of rajasa stuff. Your mind is made of sattvika stuff. Since your mind, we say, sattva guna pradhana. The mind is primarily sattva guna. Sattva guna as opposed to tamas of the physical body, as opposed to rajas of prana and organs of action. So the mind being based on sattva guna, the mind, antakarana is a technical term, the mind is called sattva. Have you heard the expression sattva shuddhi? You may not have heard, but it's a common expression, sattva shuddhi. Shuddhi, purity. Purity of what? If you take sattva as sattva guna, it doesn't make sense, right? The purity of sattva guna. So in that expression, sattva shuddhi, sattva clearly means mind. Antakarana shuddhi. So here's an example that you need to know. If you're going to study independently, you need to watch out for these little tricks that can catch you. So here, sattva anurupa means in accordance with your mental traits, in accordance with your mind, as we discussed in a prior verse. Swabhavaja, according to your nature, according to the conditioning of your mind. Shraddha is, Sri Krishna explains, and that conditioning of the mind is due to what is that multiple choice test? Is it due to A, some purva janma samskaras, B, your parents, C, your upbringing, D, your choices, E, all of the above. Remember those tests, right? Okay, enough said. So now Sri Krishna. Actually, the second half is often quoted because it has some real universal wisdom in it. Sri Krishna observes that ayam purushaha, a person, is shraddha mayaha, is literally made of shraddha, more loosely, a product of shraddha. And here shraddha is used in even a more general sense. We've already given two meanings. One is simply as faith. Second is the Vedantic definition of trust pending verification. Now we get a little bit of a third meaning here, shraddha, almost in the sense of your worldview. And I think that's perhaps an unconventional translation, but I think it's meaningful. Try it. So when Sri Krishna says, Shraddha mayaha ayam purushaha, a person is the product of their world view. As you think, so you become. And that's what he concludes. Yo yat shraddhaha, a person, yat shraddhaha, according to their shraddha, according to their worldview, saha eva saha, that person becomes thus. According to our worldview molds us. Now, what do I mean by worldview? Basically, it is the sum total of how you see yourself, how you see the world around you, and how you see your place in the world around you. So it's a very all-encompassing term that describes your orientation towards life. So with that definition in mind, Shraddha mayaha ayam purushaha, a person is molded by their orientation towards life. You've seen this, right? You've seen how people, depending on how they think, how their perspective or orientation can mold so many aspects of their lives. I just give a personal example. You can find a thread that goes back into your childhood. I was raised in the 1960s. In this country, it was a time of turmoil. There was a lot of social, almost revolution. In fact, in those days, they called it a social revolution. So it was anti-war and women's rights and against the discrimination against blacks. Lots of social turmoil and tremendous divisiveness. Today we live in a very divisive time. It was worse then. Honestly, as much as we live in a very conflicted, divisive time, the divisiveness was more in the 1960s. It was generational. Anyway, the reason I'm sharing this with you is when I look back, I can see how I developed at those times an idealistic and somewhat rebellious attitude towards life. So idealistic, that was kind of the spirit of the 1960s, the hippie movement, whether you understand it thoroughly or not. It was very idealistic. Life is love, and there was a lot of idealism doesn't mean reasonable, but anyway, idealistic, and also rebellious in a sense of not accepting society as it is and wanting to change things. And when I look back, I can see how that is a thread throughout my life that has contributed in many, many positive ways. Of course, there were problems back in those days, and perhaps I suffered the consequences of those problems, but I can see how that youthful idealism and rebelliousness is like a thread that's gone through my life and has turned out to be a blessing. The reason I'm sharing this with you is many of you can recognize in your own youth, in your own childhoods and early adulthood, you can recognize some ways that your thinking was formed, molded, affected, and you can see how that was the beginning of a thread which has continued through your life. This kind of self-reflection, I feel, is helpful. As I said before, spiritual growth is highly dependent on emotional growth, and to understand ourselves emotionally, psychologically, we need to understand some of this. Why is my personality the way it is today? There are thousands of reasons, and we can understand, not all of the reasons, we can understand many of the reasons why our thinking and emotions are the way they are. That level of psychological and emotional understanding is extremely helpful, both in ordinary day-to-day life, vyavahara we call it, and in spiritual life. That kind of self-understanding is crucial to emotional maturity and crucial for spiritual growth. Enough said. Yo yat shraddha sa eva saha. According to your shraddha, according to your orientation, according to your worldview, it will determine to a large measure your path in life, your direction in life. Then, here we go with the detailed analysis. Yajante satvika devan, yajante satvika devan, yaksharakshansi rajasaha, yaksharakshansi rajasaha, pretan bhutaganans chanye, pretan bhutaganans chanye, yajante tamasa janaha, yajante tamasa satvikaha, people who have a predominance of sattva guna, people whose shraddha, whose worldview, whose orientation is sattvika, they yajante, they worship Devan, the gods. Remember, when we see this expression Devan, worship the gods, you already know that there is one God we worship in many ways, but there's another aspect here that you may not be thinking about, and that is, in ancient times, the laws of nature were not understood, so therefore the rains came because of the devas. The crops grew because of the devas. The rivers flowed because of the devas. We don't have that worldview today, but that is very much the ancient worldview. So, based on that worldview, Sri Krishna says here that those who have sattvika, shraddha, they worship the gods. They worship God, Ishvara, and they worship the gods. Then, rajasaha, people whose shraddha, whose faith, whose worldview is rajasa, based on his passion and desire. Who do they worship? Yajante, they worship what? Raksha, yaksha, and rakshas. It's plural is the form here. Yaksha is a category of lower deities. I don't know, somehow they get sometimes translated as divine nymphs. How's that? You'll find translations. Yaksha are divine, the good ones, divine nymphs. The rakshas are the not so good ones. Raksha means rakshasa. So we have these divine nymphs and divine imps. You can find translations that use that language. They're kind of old, but anyway, you'll find those translations. And what about those who are tamasa? Last line. Tamasaha janaha, people who are tamasa in their shraddha, in their worldview, in their orientation. Yajante, who do they worship? Pretan, the dead. And bhuta ganan. Most of you raised in India, you are familiar with pret and bhut. Bhuta meaning ghost. That comes in how many stories and fables, etc., etc. Excuse me. So here's Sri Krishna's reference. Now, I'm kind of making fun of it because it is certainly archaic. Let's not forget, we're studying a scripture that's the writing is 2,000 years old. The story is much older than that. So we should expect some archaic expressions here and there when we're studying, just for fun. If Sri Krishna were teaching this in modern times, what would he say? He would say, Sattvika people worship Ishvara. Good. Rajasa people, so here, Rajasic people worship spirits and demons. In modern times, Rajasic people worship money and power. How's that? Tamasic people worship not the dead and ghosts. Tamasic people worship drugs and alcohol. I think this would be a modern revision of this verse. But the point is very clear. According to our attitude towards life, our worldview, it will affect our behavior, every aspect of our behavior. Now, next topic. Those tamasic people we described in chapter 16 as being asura, having these asura tendencies, these demonic tendencies. So Sri Krishna wants to emphasize this a little bit more. I'm just pausing now because here's an interesting reflection. Remember back in the prior chapter, Sri Krishna talked, I think, 3 verses about Daiva Sampat, but he went on for many, many more verses about Asura Sampat. And then here again, in this verse and the next verse, he's back to this asura sampat. So why is Sri Krishna fixated on that? Why is he putting so much emphasis on that? Consider the context. They're on a battlefield. They're facing this enemy which is an embodiment of this asura sampat. And in those of you who know the story of the Mahabharata well, there is no better example of someone who's an embodiment of the asura sampat than Duryodhana. If you know the story well, Duryodhana is a prime example of asura sampat and the consequences of asura sampat. So the fact that he has asura sampat is not just a consequence on his life, but he was the key figure that caused the Mahabharata war and the death of hundreds of thousands of warriors. Look at the consequences of asura sampat. In World War II, it was Adolf Hitler. Almost 100 million people died in World War II. That's mind-boggling. Tens of millions of people died in World War II. Why? Asura sampat consequences. I just watched a documentary on the Iraq War, Saddam Hussein. I'm not justifying everything that went on in those wars, but here's another example of a person who is an embodiment of asura sampat causing these consequences. We all suffer the consequence of other people having asura sampat. And perhaps that context, being on this battlefield, facing an enemy who is an embodiment of this asura sampat, perhaps we can see better why Sri Krishna put so much emphasis on that in both chapters 16 and then here in chapter 17. So here he says, talking about those with asura sampat. Shastra vihitam ghoram, shastra vihitam ghoram, tapyante ye tapojanaha, tapyante ye tapojanaha, dambhahankara samyuktaha, dambhahankara samyuktaha, kamaraga balanvitaha, kamaraga balanvitaha. Start in the second line, where Sri Krishna describes janaha, people who, ye janaha, those people who tapyante, perform tapas. Those people who perform tapas. What kind of tapas? Ghoram tapas. You may have heard that expression. Terrible tapas. Tapas which is ashastra vihitam, which is not prescribed in the scriptures. So terrible tapas that is not described in the scriptures. Why would people do this? When I see this verse, in my mind comes a thought. Many of you are familiar with a tradition called Tantra. Tantra it's a complicated subject matter, but the focus of tantrika sadhana, the spiritual practices of Tantra, are using spiritual methodologies for worldly goals. I think that's an accurate depiction. Maybe some scholars might argue with me about that, but I think in general, you could say that Tantra is the use of spiritual methods like tapas, like yajna, ritual worship, like mantras. Generally, we use tapas, mantras, and worship for the sake of spiritual growth. Suppose you were to use those same spiritual practices, use mantras not for spiritual growth, but for worldly means. To use rituals and tapas, not for spiritual growth, but for worldly purposes. So I think this is a fairly accurate description of Tantra. You can see why we don't teach it, why we don't even really discuss it, because it is a complete sidetrack. If you've heard that Tantra is associated with sex, that is a very, very small part of it. So don't generalize, but it happens to be true. There is an association, but that element is really quite small. I've done an overview study of this tradition. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that seems to be what Sri Krishna is describing here. He says, those who do this ghora tapas, these terrible austerities which are ashastra vihitam. So there is ghora tapas that is shastra vihitam, that is described in the scriptures, in the Puranas. You find stories of some rishi, some saint who fasts for years at a time, or who stands on one leg for 100 years. We have all these fantastic stories in the Puranas, examples of ghora tapas, someone who meditates encircled by blazing fires. We find those stories in the Puranas. All of those stories are talking about the use of tapas for the sake of spiritual growth. Many of those stories end with that great saint, as a result of their tapas, they gain darshan, they are blessed with the revelation of God in some form. Some deity is invoked and appears to them as a result of their austerities. That's Shastra Vihitam, Ghoram Tapas. Ghoram Tapas, terrible tapas, described in the Puranas. Described in the Puranas means Shastra Vihitam. Here we're talking about Shastra Vihitam. Why are they doing that tapas? Not for the sake of seeing Lord Vishnu. You see my point? So this, to me, looks tantrika, and you can see their motivation, the motivation of why do the people do that kind of ghora tapas? What is their motivation? Second half. They are dhamma, ahankara, samyuktaha. They are samyukta, they are endowed with ahankara, pride, and dambha, hypocrisy and arrogance, and they are kama, raga, bala, anvitaha. They are also endowed with kama, desire, raga, passion, and bala, strength, aggressiveness. So anyway, I checked some commentaries. No commentator mentions tapas. No commentator mentions tantra. So I might be wrong, but I get that sense in this verse that Sri Krishna might be referring to that. And it becomes Sri Krishna's criticism becomes even stronger in this next verse. We'll see that. Excuse me. Karshayanta sharirastham, karshayanta sharirastham, bhutagramamachetasaha, bhutagramamachetasaha, mam chaivanta sharirastham, maichavanta sharirastham, Tan vidyasura nishchayan, tan vidyasura nishchayan. So those people doing this ghora tapas, and Sri Krishna is focusing on this upavasa, fasting. And you find stories in Puranas, Shastra, Vihitam tapas, but we're talking now about Shastra, Vihitam. And talking about that tapas, Sri Krishna says, karshayantaha. They they weaken, they destroy, they torture. That's good. They torture. Bhuta gramam sharirastham. They torture bhuta gramam, this assemblage of elements, which is sharirastham, abiding in the form of your physical body. And why do they do that? Achetasaha. They're not thinking properly, so they are misguided, as the last half of the prior verse said. They're filled with ignorance, kama, desire, passion. They're misguided. Their goals are guided by kama instead of a desire for spiritual growth. So here's a good example. You can do the same spiritual practice, upavasa. You can do it for a spiritual purpose or a shastra vihitam, a non-spiritual purpose, as in the case of tantra or some other related practice. But that really, it's self-harm. We've spoken many times, ahimsa paramo dharma, that the main principle of dharma is not causing harm. That includes your own body. Ishvara gave you this body. Who are you to hurt it? So this is a criticism Sri Krishna says here. And then he furthers his criticism in the second half. He says, Mam cha eva anta sharirastam. He says also, they karshayantaha, they are torturing mam cha. They are also torturing me. Anta sharirastam, abiding in the body. Sri Krishna says, I abide in every person's body. Why are they torturing me in that way? You can see his kind of impassioned words here. He's really speaking with some emotional charge. Why are they torturing me in this way? The key again, ashastra vihitam. They are not doing this fasting for a spiritual purpose. They're doing it for a worldly purpose. And Sri Krishna concludes, Tan vidhi, O Arjuna, you should understand them to be asura nishchayan. You should understand them to have asura sampat. Their nishchaya, their orientation is asuric, is demonic. We're going to see the next verse. It's very short because it'll then wrap up this class very nicely and introduce the next class. So let's see that. Aharastvapi sarvasya, aharastvapi sarvasya, trividho bhavati priyaha, trividho bhavati priyaha, yajñastapasthatha dhanam, yajñastapasthatha dhanam, tesham bhedamimam shrunu, tesham bhedamimam shrunu. So Sri Krishna has just concluded his discussion on Shraddha. 3 kinds of Shraddha, Sattvika, Rajasa, Tamasa. Now he continues to the next topic. Next topic is Ahara, food. Food, Ahara, you have to jump down and connect it to Priyaha, end of the second line. Food which is desirable. Sarvasya, for all people. The food that people like, Trividha bhavati, is also of 3 kinds. People like 3 kinds of food: sattvika food, rajasa food, tamasa food. Then he also says that yajñaha. So the yajña, the kinds of worship people do, is also trividha bhavati. It's also 3 kinds of yajña. Tapas, as I said in my introduction. 3 kinds of yajña, 3 kinds of tapas. tapas, austerity, as we just described, 3 kinds of dana, charity. So here we have a roadmap for the coming verses. Tesham bhedam, the distinctions among them, imam shrinu. Listen to this, Arjuna, as I describe the distinctions of this. And when we begin our next class, we'll begin here with a discussion about the importance of lifestyle. This is sometimes neglected in spiritual life, but it turns out that if you fail, you know this already, if you fail to live a healthy lifestyle, you're going to suffer the consequences. And one thing we're going to see is Sri Krishna's very practical approach described in this chapter about the importance of having a healthy lifestyle, but in this context. Healthy lifestyle for the sake of spiritual growth. That's the context. We'll see that in our next class. Okay, quick announcements. I'm publishing a video almost every week in this question-answer series. We just published a video on Om versus Aum. You might, which is correct? You already know which is correct, but you might find that video interesting to understand why is Om correct. So watch that video. And there are other ones published before that. Tomorrow, Sunday, we have our Vedanta class at 10 o'clock. We continue to see Shankaracharya's brilliant work, Upadesha Sahasri. And then immediately after the Vedanta class at 11 o'clock, Satsang. So please come join us with your questions. And we'll conclude with our brief prayers at the altar. Oh, I've just been reminded to remind you that daylight savings time begins tomorrow. Be sure to adjust your clock before you come for class. Om Gananahan Tva Ganapatigam Havamahe Gaving Gavinam Upamashravastamam Jeshtarajam Brahmanam Brahmanaspatahana Shrinvan Uttabasira Saranam Om Mahaganapataye Namaha Ishvaro Gururatmeti Murti Bheda Vibhagine Vyomavad Vyapta Dehaya Dakshina Murtaye Namaha Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramardanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadguru Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschad Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Satgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Ma Amritangamaya Om Shanti 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 Om Tat Sat